This is going to be our last lecture on unions. It deals with the concept of bargaining power. I would argue that the idea of bargaining power is a relatively simple but a relatively powerful idea to understand what happens when a union and management sit down to negotiate a deal. I think once we define what bargaining power is and you see how it works, it's even something you can use in your own dealing with people, employers, and others. So let's take a look. Suppose currently workers are working and the wage rate is $12 an hour. The contract has expired and now they're negotiating a new contract. So let's say that these are the possible ranges, possible wage rates that we might see an agreement on: 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, or $16 an hour. So how do we figure out where in this range the final settlement between the union and management is going to be? Well, management generally wants a lower wage. They're going to say, at some point, it's just too high. It'll put us out of business. We talked about efficiency wages, and management might realize paying more might have a benefit. But if the wage rate gets too high, they say, nope, nope, we can't do that. We just won't go for that. Now, also, they might not cut the wages from 12 to 11. We talked about the idea that wages are sticky in a downward direction. It is very difficult to cut wages. Management might say any cost saving we would get, we would lose in terms of morale and productivity. We won't cut wages. So what management says is, we want something in the range of $12 to $15, and the lower the wage is, the more we prefer that. We'd like to get as low wage as possible, but not have to cut wages, and there is an upper limit. We just won't go beyond that. Now let's look at the union. In general, a union wants a higher wage. They say, look, we want to get paid more money. So the union might say, well, we've been working hard. We're not going to accept the same wage. We want a wage of at least $13 an hour. So what we see here is that both sides are willing to settle for a wage rate between $13 and $15 an hour. Now, you might say, well, the midpoint's 14. So that's where the wage rate's going to be, but no. Can we develop some ideas that will determine whether or not the final settlement will be closer to $13 an hour, what management wants, or closer to $15 an hour, what the union wants? Well, somebody who studied industrial relations, Neil Chamberlain, developed a very simple and powerful model called bargaining power. A union's bargaining power, in other words, the extent that they can get that wage increase closer to $15, a union's bargaining power is the management's cost, the employer's cost of disagreeing with what the union is asking for, relative to the management's cost of agreeing. In other words, if the person you're negotiating with finds it very costly to disagree with you, you have a lot of bargaining power. Can we think of a situation where somebody had a lot of bargaining power because it was very costly to disagree with them? I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse. Okay, Marlon Brando playing Don Corleone in The Godfather, he was able to make people an offer that they couldn't refuse. You want to disagree with the Don? Well, you might find, yourself dead, or, and one guy who found his horse's head cut off. Ooh, what a scene. Okay, anyway, it's very, you have a lot of bargaining power if the other side finds it difficult to disagree with you. So, the union has a lot of bargaining power if management finds it difficult or costly to disagree. Management's bargaining power. What power does management have? Well, that's the union's cost of disagreeing with the management's, what management wants, relative to the union's cost of agreeing with what management wants. If the union finds it very difficult, very expensive to disagree with management, then management has a lot of bargaining power. The idea, what is the other side's cost of disagreeing with you relative to their cost of agreeing with you? So what we see here is the relative bargaining power. There's no formulas, there's no math, whatever. If the union has a lot of bargaining power, if management finds it costly to disagree with the union, you're going to get a settlement close to $15 an hour. If, however, management has a lot of bargaining power, then the settlement is going to be closer to $13 an hour. So that raises a question. What determines the relative costs of disagreeing with the other side? Well, in general, unions' bargaining power is greater. It's very costly for management to disagree relative to agreeing if the product that you make is perishable. Suppose, for the sake of argument, as happened in Ohio when I first started teaching at Ohio Wesleyan, the tomato crop was ready to pick, and the tomato pickers went on strike. Now, it turns out once the tomatoes are ripe, if you don't pick them, they spoil. So if the product is perishable, then the result is the union has a lot of bargaining power. You can think about this if hotel workers go on strike before the Super Bowl. A lot of people go to the rent hotel rooms before the Super Bowl. They have a lot of bargaining power at that moment. So when the product is perishable in hotel rooms, if you don't sell it tonight, it's gone. You've lost that opportunity. Another thing, can the union strike? If the union can strike, they can tell management, hey, you don't give us what we want, we're going on strike. I mentioned in passing before the World Series, the biggest event in baseball. In 2011, the umpires went on strike. Boy, it was very costly for management to disagree. They couldn't really get good replacement umpires for the most important baseball game of the year. If the union has the right to strike, management finds it expensive to disagree. Remember what we said about federal employees? They don't have that right. So federal employees have less bargaining power because they don't have the right to strike. State and local employees, it depends. It varies from state to state. Is it hard to get a replacement worker? The union has a great deal of power if you can't replace them. Let me give you an example. If all of the ER nurses go on strike, you're not going to be able to get a replacement nurse. If, however, the people working at 7-Eleven go on strike, they can probably go out and find somebody that will replace them. So if it's hard to get somebody to replace labor, then it's very difficult for management not to give the union what they want, and the union has a great deal of bargaining power. Management's bargaining power. Well, it's greater if the union finds out it's expensive to disagree with management. Unions frequently will try and have a strike fund. What they might do is out of every paycheck, they might say $5 goes into a very special fund. And if the union goes on strike, then the workers are able to draw on that fund and have some money so that they can live while the strike is going on. If the union doesn't have a strike fund and they go on strike, what are they going to live on? It's very costly for them to disagree. The management has a great deal of bargaining power when unemployment is high. If the management says to the workers, okay, you don't want to take $13 an hour, you don't want the low wage, great. You disagree with us, go on strike, see if you can find a job while you're on strike, because if unemployment is high, you won't be able to find one. Unions find it very hard to disagree when unemployment is high. And management finds it's probably easy to hire replacement workers when unemployment is high. And finally, if strikes are illegal, as they are for federal employees. By the way, private employees can strike. There's nothing that stops them. Can a physician working at a private hospital go on strike? Yes. Wait, don't we need them? Yes. Can they legally go on strike? Yes, they can. Federal employees can't, and state and local employees, cannot in some states. In fact, in most states they can't. And police and fire cannot go on strike anywhere in the United States. But the idea here is, if if strikes are illegal, it gives management more bargaining power. If the union, as happened with the air traffic controllers, goes on strike against the federal government who runs the airports, their cost of disagreeing was they were fired. And that is a big cost of disagreeing. Now, just a last word. We talked a little bit about strikes. We mentioned in 1947, when Taft-Hartley was passed, it was a year with a large number of strikes. And you can see these are just strikes that affected a lot of workers, 1,000 people or more. So there were 270 big strikes. This is in thousands, so over 1.5 million workers went on strike, and the number of days lost to strike was about 25,700 days were lost to strikes. Now, it turns out in the United States, compared to some European countries, workers don't strike quite as much. This figure, the number of days lost to strikes, has always been below 0.5%. So in some countries like Italy, it'll be several percent, but in the United States, we have relatively low strikes compared to Europe. Now, notice what happened. The number of strikes has declined tremendously by 1990. By the time you guys were born, you can see it had, that was a year when there was a big strike, but after that, in your lifetime, strikes were really kind of low. So in 1947, there were 270 large strikes. In 2010-11, in 2017, there were only 7. There was a tremendous decline in strikes. Recently, however, we've seen an increase in the last couple of years. The number of strikes, it's not back where it was in 47, but we've seen it actually in the public sector. As you may have heard and seen in the news, teachers have gone on strike, demanding wage increases and better fringe benefits. So we have seen that recently. So just a few words, I guess the takeaway, and I always tell you, don't memorize the numbers. What's the story the numbers tell you? Strikes are a lot less frequent than they were in the 1940s. But in recent years, they've ticked up a little bit, nowhere near where they were before. And relative to the other countries, there's relatively few strikes in the United States. Okay, I think I'm going to make one more video, and that is going to be on unemployment. So we'll see you back there with that.